In 2018, researchers modeling a specific worst-case scenario, every satellite operator on Earth simultaneously losing the ability to maneuver, calculated that it would take about 121 days before that loss of control resulted in a catastrophic collision somewhere in orbit. A study published in early 2026 ran the same calculation using current conditions. The title was the answer, 2.8 days. This scenario has a name in the astrodynamics community. Kessler Syndrome, first described by NASA scientist Donald Kessler in 1978. The concept is straightforward and genuinely alarming. Once you sit with it, you realize how alarming it is. A collision between two objects in orbit doesn't just destroy those two objects, it creates hundreds or thousands of new fragments, each one now a projectile traveling at roughly 27,000 kilometers per hour. Each of those fragments becomes a new collision risk to everything else in orbit. Enough of these cascading collisions, and you get a self-sustaining chain reaction. Debris generating more debris faster, even faster than it naturally decay out of orbit, potentially rendering entire altitude bands usable for spacecraft for decades or longer. For most of the space age, this was a slow-moving theoretical concern. What changed is the sheer population density of low Earth orbit. There are currently roughly 7,500 active satellites in orbit, the overwhelming majority launched within the past several years, driven by the rise of mega-constellations like Starlink, Kuiper, and comparable Chinese systems, layered on the top of the active satellites. Approximately 34,000 trackable debris objects larger than 10 centimeters, and an estimated 130 million untrackable fragments between 1 millimeter and 10 centimeters, small enough to evade tracking, large enough to disable or destroy a functioning satellite on impact. This is where the 2026 research adds something genuinely new. The study's authors, Thiele, Hyland, Bully, and Lawler, introduced a metric they call the collision realization and a significant harm clock, or crash clock, specifically designed to make the risk legible as a single trackable number rather than an abstract probability. The method calculates how long it would take for a catastrophic collision to occur if all active collision avoidance maneuvering stopped simultaneously. For instance, during a major solar storm severe enough to disable satellite guidance systems across the board, as of June 2025, the number stood at 2.8 days. The same calculation for even a 24-hour total loss of control carries a 30% probability of a major collision severe enough to potentially trigger a cascading chain reaction. It is worth being specific about what's driving this, rather than treating it as an abstract trend. Starlink alone now performs more than 50,000 automated collision avoidance maneuvers every 6 months, a staggering number that illustrates just how routinely close approach events are already occurring, even with active functioning avoidance systems working continuously. That is not a system without generous margin. It is a system working extremely hard in real time to prevent the exact crash scenario, or the exact scenario the crash clock measures. Kessler Syndrome stopped being purely theoretical on February 10, 2009. An active Iridium communication satellite collided with a defunct Russian Cosmos satellite over Siberia. The first over collision between two intact satellites, the impact generated more than 2,000 pieces of trackable debris, instantly and measurably raising the collision risk for every other object sharing that altitude band. It was a small-scale contained preview of exactly the cascading mechanism the crash clock research is now trying to quantify at a much larger scale. Nothing about the underlying physics has changed since 2009. What has changed is simply how many more satellites now occupy the same crowded neighborhood where the first collision happened. Here is a structural problem worth understanding clearly. Space traffic management, the process of coordinating collision avoidance across different satellite operators and different countries, remains almost entirely voluntary. There is no binding international air traffic control equivalent for orbit. The United States, Russia, and China each operate their own space situational awareness systems, and while some data sharing occurs informally, there is no structural mechanism requiring a Chinese constellation operator to coordinate maneuvers with a Starlink satellite or on a converging path, or vice versa. Each operator is individually incentivized to protect their own satellites, with a collective outcome avoiding a cascading debris event that would damage everyone's assets simultaneously. Requires a level of coordination the current system was never built to provide. Not all orbital debris carries equal long-term risk, and this distinction matters for where mitigation effort should concentrate. Below roughly 600 kilometers, atmospheric drag, however faint at that altitude, still exerts enough pull to bring debris back down into the atmosphere within a matter of years, where it burns up harmlessly. Above roughly 900 kilometers, that drag becomes negligible, and debris generated there can remain in orbit for centuries. The 600 to 900 kilometer band sits in between and current research identifies that as the zone of greatest near-term concern, dense enough with both active satellites and existing debris fragments from past events to represent the most probable location for the kind of cascading collision the crash clock is designed to measure. It is not a coincidence that newer constellations, including Starlink, have deliberately chosen to operate at the lower end of this range, partly because of the faster natural cleanup that altitude provides. The response, appropriately, is following standard engineering logic: reduce the rate of new debris creation and begin actively removing what's already there. On the prevention side, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission adopted a 5-year post-mission disposal rule in 2022, requiring newly licensed low Earth orbit satellites to deorbit within 5 years of the end of their operational life, a significant tightening from the previous 25-year guideline, which current analysis suggests was never adequate for a congested environment like today's. Compliance among major operators is genuinely improving. Starlink's newer generation satellites, for instance, are specifically designed for a 5-year operational life that aligns with the disposal timeline. On the removal side, the European Space Agency, in partnership with the Swiss company ClearSpace, is targeting 2026 for a landmark active debris removal mission using a robotic arm to physically capture and deorbit a long discarded payload adapter left over from a previous ESA mission. It is a modest first step, technically demonstrated but not yet economically solved at scale. A mission removing a single 95-kilometer object carries a contract value of roughly 86 million euros, which illustrates just how far the cost of active debris removal still needs to fall before it can operate at anything like the scale the debris population actually requires. We built an economy, navigation, weather forecasting, global communications, financial timestamping, on the assumption that low Earth orbit would simply remain usable indefinitely. The crash clock research is a reminder that this was never a law of physics. It was a margin, and that margin has been shrinking in plain sight, measured now not in months, but in days. The good news, if there is any, is that the fix, better tracking, faster deorbiting, real coordination between operators, is entirely within our engineering capability. The only open question is whether the incentive to actually build it arrives before the clock runs out. Thank you so much for your presence, and I'm really looking forward your comments, your questions. Make sure I'll read each and every one of them. Thank you so much for your presence once again, and see you next time.